This video is sponsored by Surfshark. More on them later. We really do have a lot of gaming history to look back on these days. We've long moved past the point of the industry feeling its way around and trying to create an empire for itself, since we're knee-deep in a highly commercialized industry that is constantly looking for new ways to make money, but I do find a lot of value in pausing and looking back on where we've come. Technology might not be advancing as quickly as before, but when you consider what games used to look like, it's a little bit crazy that a lot of older games still hold up very nicely despite their appearances. If anything, you can take this video as a lesson about not judging games based on seemingly primitive graphics, because actually, we wouldn't be where we are right now if it weren't for games so good that they're still amazing decades later. You gotta respect your elders.
Determining what constitutes an old game that has aged well is a little tricky to pin down because we all have our own different perspectives on what is actually considered old. So I'm just going to say anything from around the turn of the century and older is fair game, which is kind of funny because that's roughly around the age that I got interested in exploring the internet and browsing some websites, but of course we didn't quite have the software and the ability to protect ourselves from scary internet pirates. They were a thing in the 2000s, look it up!
Of course, internet security is even more important all these years later because everything we do is through the internet, including watching this video. So it might be worth looking at VPNs like today's sponsors Surfshark, who have industry-leading protocols for keeping your stuff protected and numerous international server connections. VPNs like Surfshark allow you to connect to servers across the world, with Surfshark specifically having over 1,800 servers spread across 63 different countries, which gives you access to international streaming libraries for services like Netflix or Hulu. Plus, there's some more serious applications that are worth mentioning, since keeping those sneaky internet pirates away is more important than ever these days, and with Surfshark you can secure your data by using uncrackable encryption and the best VPN protocols on the market, giving you the confidence to join public Wi-Fi, safe in the knowledge that all of your stuff is nice and safe. Surfshark is easy to install and can run on unlimited devices from a single subscription, so you can safely do your exciting internet stuff on a massive number of platforms, and with a 30-day money-back guarantee and 24/7 live customer support, that's pretty damn good! You can go to surfshark.deals/RabbidLuigi and enter the promo code RabbidLuigi for 83% off and 3 extra months for free. That link is also in the video's description if you don't fancy typing all of that out. Secure your connection now with Surfshark.
Okay then, let's talk about games that have got better with age. You know, like pickles.
So the first thing I need to mention is just how many well-aged games there are out there. They're easy to spot because they typically have the kind of staying power that helps launch entire franchises and keep people talking about them many years down the line, so just know that a ton of games could have been here, and yet I'm attempting the nigh on impossible task of picking just 5. It's like blindly throwing darts at a board full of bullseyes and being disappointed that I didn't hit one specific bullseye on the board. It's just gonna happen, okay? A lot of games were pioneers for their respective genres and laid a lot of groundwork for games to surpass them in the future, but there are some like the original Halo that were so good that few games have adequately improved on the core concept. I mean, seriously, if Halo Infinite was just a modern retreading of Combat Evolved, Microsoft would be fresh out of problems.
I do sometimes wonder if that's part of the reason why Microsoft has struggled since the release of the original Halo, because the momentum that game gave Microsoft and their Xbox was kind of a bit ridiculous. You could put that game on any console from around that time and it would have done really well. So the fact that they've managed to make a future from that game is impressive, but the momentum has died and dwindled, and now they have to rely on new IPs doing slightly less impressive things. So, you know, they just need more Halo, and specifically Halo 1, and everything will be fine.
Being 6 in 2001 has its advantages, mainly that I've lived in 2 different millennia, and my family didn't own an Xbox because I was too young to play Halo, but as I got older and became more aware of games that I missed out on as a child, it allowed me to play the first game about a decade later, and with experience of other more modern shooters. Halo Combat Evolved definitely is a different kind of game to what we have nowadays, but in a way that helps it to avoid too many direct comparisons and allows Halo 1 to thrive as a really well put together FPS that was obviously good enough on its own to launch its own franchise, but also Halo was so incredible that it made Microsoft's original paperweight a really enticing purchase, and honestly, any game that was outstanding enough to do that could be described as having aged really well. This was Microsoft stealing a march on the competition, and they did so well that every similar new FPS franchise after this for a while was being labelled as the Halo Killer, a sign of just how much success this game brought Microsoft at the perfect time. You could easily make the argument that Halo 3 is the better game, but for a 20-year-old game, Halo 1 has aged beautifully and will still give you a wonderful time all these years later. Makes you wonder where everything went wrong, really. Hey, do you know which game is virtually guaranteed to age well in the future? As in, make this video 20 years down the road and what would be on here? Hollow Knight has all the hallmarks of a game that is very likely to feel just as good in the future as it does now, with a flawless adoption of Metroidvania conventions and some stylish combat sprinkled on top for good measure. I look at this game and it's probably the closest we've come as an evolved species to surpassing the perfect storm of game design that in 1994 coalesced into the form of Super Metroid. I don't talk about this game very often, but I feel like I should find an excuse to do so a bit more often, because you aren't likely to find another game out there where every part of it is pulling in the same direction and is all serving the same purpose. Metroid wasn't completely established by the time that Super Metroid came along, since the first game was a fun but clunky proof of concept, and the sequel on the Game Boy took a nosedive in quality to fit on a handheld, so this was by no means an easy game to make for Nintendo. Could you say with any great confidence what the essence of Metroid was from the first two games alone? It's no easy task, but one that Nintendo found resounding success with through the simple decision to prioritize atmosphere above all else. Atmosphere is one of those fun little features that is virtually immune to aging, since when done right, it talks to that small part of your brain that responds to threats with a response somewhat akin to, "Oh fuck, I don't like this!" Super Metroid marks a turn in the Metroid franchise that draws more from the unknown terrors of space, and while it's far from a horror game, the added atmosphere and increased tension allows it to carry greater relevancy decades down the line. Not to mention that even if everything was fine and the ambience was as flat as a pancake, Super Metroid helped to truly establish what the Metroidvania genre is all about, with a huge interconnected map that incorporates organic backtracking that knits story and gameplay together in such a way that keeps everything moving in the right direction super smoothly. Quite a lot of the games we've played since have used at least some of these features, and if they weren't perfected so expertly in Super Metroid, I don't think we'd have gotten the likes of Axiom Verge or Ori, and especially not Cave Story, but maybe not even games like Dark Souls with all of its backtracking. You can't put an expiry date on influence.
I'm trying really hard to not call on games from my childhood, because nostalgia has this habit of warping old memories to be better than they actually were, and if I sat here and filled this entire video with games from my childhood because I was basing it on how good the games were when I was a kid, and you know, obviously they're great because nostalgia, I think this video wouldn't be very interesting to watch. But I am only human, and I can only hold out for so long.
Although it is worth mentioning that while Super Mario World was a game from my childhood, my first exposure to the game was the GBA remake that came out nearly a decade later, and is itself a positive endorsement of the staying power of Super Mario World. If the gap between these two versions seems like a big wait, then you might be pleased or horrified to know that Super Mario World is 31 years old this year, which for comparison is the same age the original Super Mario Bros. Was around the same time that zookeepers were putting holes in gorillas. You know, saying that Super Mario Bros. Is 3 decades old works in my mind because it looks like an old game, but to say the same about Super Mario World just feels incorrect. How can it be so old when it still feels like the gold standard of 2D Mario platforming, and at times the entire platforming genre in general? Why are we even making new games? The thing I keep coming back to with Super Mario World is how easy it is to play, and yet how crazy things can become without breaking the feel of the game. You can throw Mario around the screen, bouncing across the heads of enemies and hopefully not straight down a hole to your doom, and when you gain a comprehensive understanding of how the physics engine reacts and how Mario accelerates on the ground and through the air, it is some of the most fun you can have with a Mario platformer. Some of the later levels, and especially the optional bonus levels at the end, show just how absurd things can become, and yet these stages feel more like natural extensions of what you've learned throughout your adventure than anything cheap and unnecessarily cruel. Though I would say Kaizo Mario World is a hell of an experience that uses assets from Super Mario World in a way that demonstrates some of the more advanced mechanics indicative of a really well-made video game. Hardly the experience that many will have with Super Mario World, but it's good to know that these possibilities are there if you're feeling sadistic enough. Sadism doesn't generally age well. RPGs haven't changed much since the early days. Of course, we have variations on the genre that like to inject a bit more action into the mix so that you're not just taking turns beating the crap out of each other, but there are still plenty of franchises out there that work in broadly the same way as the classic RPGs of old. Really, the only thing that has undergone any significant changes is the presentation, since we've now got more powerful hardware that can represent the role-playing experience with a bit more gravitas. And yet, contrary to everything you'd think, Chrono Trigger is absolutely drenched from head to toe in gravitas, and with presentation so impressive that it often doesn't feel like a game from the mid-1990s. I suppose it does a little, since there's a clear through line with Final Fantasy VI, with both games being developed by Square Enix and them being on top of their game, but there's something a little extra special about Chrono Trigger that doesn't happen often with any old game. Feels like something we've never seen before.
We've become a bit more experimental with RPGs in the 21st century, especially with setting, because we've all done our stints with the medieval castle full of wizards and magic and goblins, and frankly that's the standard for RPG Maker these days, so it's so ingrained into our knowledge of RPGs that we can move past it. And we were kind of trying to move past it in the 90s, but could you imagine the paradigm shift when Chrono Trigger strolled into the mid-90s and laid down a marker and said, you know what, I'm gonna do things differently, and you know how? By just fucking around with time.
So it's not just the concept of a time-traveling RPG that is so enticing, since anyone could do that with enough imagination, but the complexity with which Square Enix made Chrono Trigger to ensure that this premise is less of a gimmick and more of a foundation is kind of ridiculous to look back on. Honestly, the effort that went into the world that Chrono Trigger is set in, and each individual highly varied time period that you travel to, demonstrates to me that there was an incredibly talented team of people behind this game who were able to create a timeless RPG set against a backdrop of beautiful visuals and a stunning soundtrack. In terms of how all of this has aged, Chrono Trigger hits that perfect sweet spot, where of course the visuals aren't as realistic as what we're capable of now, but because Square squeezed every last drop out of the 16-bit restrictions, even after all these years it looks incredible when you remember what games were capable of at this point in time. And if you think where Chrono Trigger went from here to the rough 3D edges of Chrono Cross, it just makes you appreciate all of this even more. Hey, the 16-bit aesthetic is making a return, so clearly we yearn for these days. Of course a game about time travel was ahead of its time. What would you expect? I've just realised that most of the games on this video came out on the SNES, and trust me, that wasn't done deliberately. Maybe that just goes to show how great that console was, or how good in general Nintendo are at creating something timeless that can be appreciated just as much decades later as it was on release day. Not that it matters much when considering my number one pick, since I reckon puzzle games age the best out of any genre out there, probably because the gameplay side of things is such a core part of the experience that no great change in technology will improve. This is 100% the case with Tetris, which initially hit the shelves in 1984 and quickly made a name for itself as an addictive puzzle game that every self-respecting video gamer on the planet needs to experience for themselves. What started as a Soviet-funded project in computer science quickly exploded into a global phenomenon that every man, woman, and company wanted their hands on. And all these years later, not much has changed. Crucially, Tetris itself hasn't changed much, and that's because it doesn't need to. All these other games have aged well because they formed the core of franchises that will continue to make small tweaks and additions to hopefully improve, but Tetris is unique for many different reasons. You could argue the same for a lot of classic games from the 80s like Pac-Man, since they haven't exactly undergone many changes since then, but it is kind of terrifying how much of a constant Tetris has been throughout gaming history. Not only has it stayed broadly the same as the original concept from 1984 because there was no reason to change it, but people's attitudes surrounding Tetris have hardly had some kind of seismic shift either. It's maybe not the game you always seek out if you've got some time to waste, but you can play some Tetris with some very secure knowledge that you know exactly what you're gonna get and that it will be a good time. A fact made all the more apparent by the small tweaks done to it, like the stylish visuals of Tetris Effect and how it embraced modern conventions so seamlessly with Tetris 99. How many games out there play as though they've genuinely not aged a day in their lives? Dermatologists must hate it.
This is RabbidLuigi, and the more I think about Tetris and its incredible longevity, the more I get a bit terrified of staring into this void of timelessness. If you think what has happened in our world since 1984, it's virtually unrecognizable. So many events have happened, the world has changed permanently in the last 37 years, and yet Tetris hasn't changed at all. It just doesn't add up. In the future, when this world has been scorched and we're, foraging for water all day, we'll probably still come back and play Tetris and find it really fun. It's the immortal video game.
Hi, just want to give a quick shout out to some of my top supporters on Patreon. We have Ramon Alberto, Jerome Kiryu, Fusion Warrior, Sarah Malion, Christopher Robinson, Joe Creamer, Scott Riker, Frank Guillong, I think, I'm so sorry, The Green Scorpion, and Devon Hart. Thank you all for supporting what I do on YouTube, and if you want to join them, you can go to patreon.com/RabbidLuigi, where I post updates and behind the scenes stuff, and we generally have a really good time. Also, what topic would you like to see me cover next? Leave your suggestion in a comment on this video, because I'll be taking the best ideas and making a poll on my community tab, which you can then vote on to decide what the next video is about. I'll be announcing the winner of the poll over on my Twitter, so make sure you follow me so you don't miss out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.